Some courtrooms don't erupt, they unravel, quietly. A name gets called, a fine is issued, another case moves on. No one blinks, no one listens, and justice becomes routine instead of reflection. That was Judge Marlene Whitaker's courtroom. 30 years on the bench, swift, efficient, unshakable, until the morning she fined a man without even looking up. He didn't argue, he didn't protest. He just said one sentence and the whole room changed. Because beneath that quiet voice was a federal badge. And behind that badge was a lesson she never saw coming. This isn't a story about power, it's about presence. About what happens when someone finally slows down just enough to see. But first, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments below. It was just after 7 when Judge Marlene Whitaker stepped out of her rust-colored sedan and into the sharp chill of the courthouse lot, her heels clicking softly against the worn concrete, the sky above still clinging to dawn's last hush, like an old blanket reluctant to be folded. She moved with precision, her leather briefcase swinging low and steady by her side, lips pressed together in that familiar line that said more about who she'd had to become than who she'd ever wanted to be. The world hadn't exactly opened its doors for a woman like her back in the 80s, and after 3 decades on the bench, she'd learned to walk faster than doubt and keep her face still when everything inside her wanted to flinch. Inside, the courthouse smelled of old paper floor wax, and something else, something like time, compressed and stale, hanging in the vents and corners like forgotten arguments. Marlene nodded to the security guard out of habit, didn't wait for the good morning, didn't need it. She moved down the long hallway lined with framed portraits of past judges, all gray-haired, all male, all watching. Her fingers brushed the edge of her robe as she walked, not to smooth it, but to remind herself it was there. That robe had been her armor for years, dignified heavy neutral. It made her untouchable, or at least it used to. Her courtroom sat quiet when she entered, as it always did. The lights buzzed faintly overhead, a soft mechanical hum that pulsed like background music only she seemed to notice. She placed her case folder on the bench with a soft thud, sat and exhaled the way. One does not from exhaustion but from expectation, the silent ritual of preparation. The bailiff Marcus stood ready by the door, eyes sharp but kind, and the clerk Sandra adjusted her glasses, murmuring something about the first case being a trespassing charge. Marlene gave a short nod, not looking up from the docket. "Let's begin," she said, her voice smooth, firm, unhurried like a gavel falling in slow motion. She barely glanced at the name Darius Rowe. Just another name on another page. Just another man who'd made a poor choice and ended up here sitting beneath her bench, waiting to be told what his life was worth in dollars and record entries. When he stepped forward, Marlene didn't raise her eyes. She noticed the silence before she noticed the man, how it stretched a bit longer than usual, as if the room itself paused. Sandra blinked, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Marcus shifted ever so slightly, but Marlene kept reading. According to the report, the man had been found asleep in the lobby just past midnight. No identification on record, no resistance, no priors. She looked up briefly, and there he was. Tall, late 50s maybe. Skin dark and lined with age but not weariness. He stood straight, arms relaxed at his sides, dressed in a plain jacket and slacks that looked too neat for a man sleeping rough. A canvas bag hung from one shoulder, faded and soft like it had been carried for years. His expression was unreadable, not defensive, not defiant, not even particularly concerned, just present. A stillness that almost felt out of place in that room. "Mr. Rowe," she said, her tone clipped, "you were found inside the building after hours without authorization. Do you have any explanation for this?" He nodded, once voice calm. "I had missed my last bus, Your Honor. It was cold. I didn't want trouble." The words hung there plain and small. No plea, no excuse. Marlene didn't react. She tapped her pen once against the desk, already moving to write the fine amount. Trespassing in a government facility carries a $750 citation. It must be paid within 30 days. Next case. He nodded again, no protest, no question. Just stepped back and turned to leave his bag, shifting slightly as he moved. Something metallic inside glinted under the fluorescent light just for a second. She didn't notice. Or maybe she did, but it didn't register. Not yet. As he passed Marcus near the door, the bailiff's eyes lingered on the bag. His brow furrowed, but he said nothing. The door clicked softly shut behind Mr. Rowe, and the courtroom settled again into its usual rhythm pages, turning names called fines, issued lives, shuffled forward like papers on a desk. But the air felt different somehow, like the faint echo of something unsaid had been left behind. Marlene leaned back slightly, her gaze dropping again to the docket, to the next case, to the next name. But for reasons she couldn't name, her hand hesitated over the page, her pen hovering in place. The silence he'd left behind wasn't the usual kind. It was the kind that made you feel like you'd missed something important, something just beneath the surface, like a sentence that ends without a period. And outside, somewhere beyond the courthouse walls, the sun kept rising anyway, indifferent to what had been said or unsaid in courtroom 3 that morning. He stepped out of the courtroom with the same quiet grace he'd entered, his feet moving slowly, but without hesitation, like a man who'd learned a long time ago that presence mattered more than noise. The hallway outside was dimly lit, the overhead fluorescence casting a pale shimmer across the tiled floor, and the faint hum of distant conversation drifted from some unseen office behind a half-closed door. His canvas bag, worn at the seams and faded from years of travel, hung loosely off his right shoulder, swaying with each step, its weight familiar not just in mass but in meaning. He didn't look angry or even disappointed, not on the surface at least, but there was something in the way. His eyes moved steadily alert, searching every corner, as if measuring the room for more than exits. The fine she'd given him wasn't what stung. It was how little it had taken, how quickly the system had reached for judgment before even asking who he was or why he had been there in the first place. He had stood with his back straight, arms at ease, never raising his voice, never interrupting, and yet the silence he carried now felt heavier than any accusation. As he reached the end of the hallway, the security guard near the rear exit glanced up from his desk, giving a brief nod that lingered a second longer than usual. "Cold morning," the guard offered, as if the words might mean more than they sounded. The man nodded back, offering a quiet "sure is" before pushing open the heavy metal door and stepping out into the brisk light of late morning. The sun had risen fully now, but the warmth hadn't followed. The air bit at the edges of his coat as he adjusted the strap of his bag higher on his shoulder. Outside, the parking lot buzzed faintly with distant traffic birds lifting off telephone wires and the mechanical clatter of a delivery truck reversing down the alley beside the courthouse loading dock. He paused beside a concrete bench near the sidewalk, not to sit, just to think and let the sound of the city settle around him. His breath fogged faintly in front of his face as he reached into the canvas bag, fingers brushing past a small notepad, an ID badge clipped to an inner pouch, and a worn fountain pen wrapped in cloth. For a moment he let his hand rest there over the badge, not pulling it out, not needing to. It wasn't about showing anyone now. It never really was. But knowing it was there grounded him, like holding onto the edge of something solid in a room where the floor kept shifting. Assistant Inspector General, Department of Justice, words that didn't mean much when no one bothered to ask who you were before labeling you something else. He wasn't bitter, not in the way people expected. Bitterness took energy he couldn't afford to spend. But weariness, that stayed with you like an old injury that didn't always limp but never really healed. Back inside, the bailiff still stood near the courtroom door, one hand resting on his belt, the other holding a clipboard. He hadn't said anything when the man passed by earlier, but now he glanced toward the closed door, then toward the bench where the man had been. Something about the quiet didn't sit right. "That guy," he murmured to the clerk, not loud enough for anyone else to hear, "didn't feel like just another trespasser." The clerk shrugged, but didn't answer. She was already moving on, already calling up the next case file, already adjusting the rhythm back to what the judge liked: fast, clean, without unnecessary pause. But the bailiff kept watching the door a little longer, the corner of his mouth pulling slightly, as if trying to name something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Meanwhile, across the street, the man stood at the corner waiting for the crosswalk light to change, one hand in his coat pocket, the other gripping the strap of his bag like it held more than just papers. A woman passed by, arms full of folders, eyes on her phone, not seeing him. Most people didn't. Not unless he said something first, not unless he flashed credentials or dropped a title. And even then it didn't always change what they saw, just how fast they pretended it had been different all along. The light blinked and he crossed. Not hurried, not slow, just steady. His shoes made soft taps on the pavement, each step measured like punctuation, in a story he'd told too many times. Inside the bag, the badge shifted again, as if reminding him it was still there, still official, still real. But real didn't matter much when the first thing they saw was skin, not status, and the first thing they assumed was weakness, not weight. He didn't look back at the courthouse. There was nothing to look back for. What mattered had already been seen or missed. But as he moved farther down the block, the edges of his mouth drew into something between a breath and a smile, quiet, restrained, but not defeated. He'd done this before. He'd carry it again. And sooner or later, someone would realize what they'd overlooked. Sometimes they never did. But sometimes, just sometimes, silence had a way of staying longer than any sentence ever could. It started small, like most things do, a quiet comment over a half-empty coffee pot in the courthouse break room, the kind of moment that didn't look like anything until it became something. The morning docket had just ended, and people filtered in with their mugs and low voices, letting the routine of caffeine and chatter fill the stale air with something human. Sandra, from Records, was the first to mention it, not loudly, just one of those passing remarks you drop between sips. "Strangest thing," she said, setting down her mug with a soft clink, "that man the judge fined this morning. I swear I've seen him before." No one responded at first, not because they weren't listening, but because they didn't quite know what to say. Moments like that had a way of hanging in the room, waiting to be taken seriously or dismissed, depending on who breathed next. Marcus the bailiff leaned against the counterarms, folded across his chest, eyes narrowing just a fraction. Tall guy older carried that bag like it was worth something, he asked, not looking at anyone directly. Sandra nodded slowly, as if confirming something she hadn't meant to believe until now. "I think he spoke at that Justice Symposium last fall," she added. "Federal something. Inspector, maybe a prosecutor." Her words weren't certain, but the room shifted slightly, like someone had turned down the volume on the background noise. Across the counter, Janice from the DA's office furrowed her brow and muttered, "You're not talking about Darius Rowe, are you? Because if that's who you mean, then yeah, I think I saw him too." The name landed with more weight than anyone expected. It didn't echo, it didn't need to. Just the sound of it changed something. Darius Rowe wasn't just another defendant. He was the man who'd written the internal review that forced a statewide audit last spring. He was the one who'd quietly exposed a corruption ring inside a neighboring sheriff's department without ever speaking to the press. He was known not because he sought attention, but because when his name appeared in your inbox, it meant someone powerful had just been caught looking the other way. "I saw a badge," Marcus finally said, almost to himself. It was tucked into the side pocket of that bag when he walked out. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried in the kind of way that made people stop pouring sugar, stop stirring cream, just to listen closer. "Didn't say anything because I wasn't sure." But now he let the sentence die on its own, and no one picked it up. They didn't need to. The thought was already running through each of them in slightly different tones. If that was him, if the judge really just fined Darius Rowe like some trespassing drifter, then something had gone sideways in that courtroom, and everyone who had been in the building that morning could feel it, whether they admitted it or not. Back in her chambers, Judge Whitaker sat at her desk with a pen resting between her fingers, unmoving. She hadn't heard the whispers yet. She didn't know the weight of the name she'd dismissed with the flick of a wrist. Not yet. But even without knowing, she felt something, an unease she couldn't name, a tightness at the base of her neck that hadn't loosened since the moment that man walked out with nothing but a nod and a thank you. Elsewhere, in the narrow hallway outside the clerk's office, two younger staffers leaned in close, whispering just beneath the hum of the overhead vents. "I think Judge Whitaker just fined a federal agent," one said, voice barely audible. The other blinked, mouth parting slightly before he could stop it. "You're kidding." "I wish I was." Their voices faded as a passing intern stepped around the corner, pretending not to hear, but filing every word into memory for later. That's how it spreads in places like this, not like fire, but like fog. Quiet, patient, impossible to hold in your hands. By early afternoon, the entire second floor of the courthouse buzzed with it, not in a chaotic way, but like a low electrical current you only notice when you touch metal. People weren't naming names aloud, not in front of superiors, but the tension was there in how emails were typed slower, in how glances lingered just a beat too long when Judge Whitaker passed by in the hallway. She noticed none of it directly, but her skin did something underneath the surface, bristling with the sense that eyes were on her but not for the reasons they used to be. In the staff lounge, someone had pulled up a headline on their phone, an archived legal bulletin that listed Darius Rowe's name among a short list of federal agents appointed to internal affairs oversight. Another staffer recognized his photo instantly. "That's him," she said quietly, holding up the screen like a mirror no one wanted to look into. "That's the guy who got fined this morning." No one laughed. No one said what they were all thinking, which was that maybe, just maybe, the judge hadn't realized who she was speaking to, and maybe that mattered more than they wanted to admit. And as the day wore on, no one could quite focus the same way they had that morning. Not because a law had been broken, but because something far more subtle had cracked open an assumption, a posture, a blind spot, the kind that couldn't be patched with policy, because it had never been written down to begin with, only practiced, quietly, daily, without thought, until now. That evening, long after the courthouse had emptied, and the fluorescent lights hummed like distant insects above hollow corridors, Judge Marlene Whitaker sat alone in her office, her desk lamp casting a soft circle of amber light over a neat stack of papers she hadn't yet touched. Outside her window, the sun had dropped below the rooflines of the downtown buildings, leaving only a smear of dusky gold across the glass, and the faint reflection of her own face staring back, tired, drawn older than she remembered feeling. Just this morning, she exhaled, slowly leaned back in her chair and rubbed the bridge of her nose with 2 fingers. A quiet gesture she did only when no one was watching, because to be seen doing it would admit to being worn down, and she wasn't sure she could afford that. Beside her briefcase, half unzipped from earlier, sat the small court folder she always carried home. Nothing urgent inside, just files she liked to double-check before morning. Habit mostly. But when she reached in to pull the first slip of paperwork free, her fingers landed instead on a thin, crisp citation printed on pale green cardstock. The name typed at the top wasn't one she expected to see again so soon: Darius Rowe. She stared at it for a moment, then turned it over slowly in her hand, as if by doing so she might make better sense of something that had been bothering her all day without fully rising to the surface. The citation read plainly: trespassing after hours, no sign of forced entry, cooperative demeanor, fined $750, no court date scheduled. There was nothing unusual about it, nothing that should have lingered in her mind longer than the seconds it took to stamp and file, and yet something had stuck. She flipped open her laptop and typed the name, not out of suspicion, but from a sense of unfinished thought, a small itch of doubt that wouldn't let her move on. The search took seconds, and the moment the first headline appeared, Inspector General Darius T. Rowe, appointed to lead federal inquiry into law enforcement misconduct, her hands froze over the keyboard. The room seemed to narrow in around her as she clicked through links, each one confirming what the others hinted at, that the man she had fined without question, dismissed without pause, had not only been more than he appeared, but had in fact been someone she should have recognized. Not because he'd worn his title like armor, but because she'd seen his name before on legal panels, in internal memos across headlines she skimmed during breakfast while thinking about court schedules and case backlog. She sat back in her chair, letting the silence swell, letting the weight of her oversight settle on her shoulders like an unwelcome coat. It wasn't just the mistake that gnawed at her, it was how quickly she'd made it, how easily the machine inside her had taken over that part of her trained to move fast, rule fast, keep order, stay neutral. But she hadn't been neutral. She'd been dismissive. And worse, she hadn't even known it. A low creak echoed from the old radiator near the bookshelf, and she jumped slightly, blinking back into the room like someone waking up mid-thought. She pushed the laptop aside, leaned forward, and pulled open the citation folder once more, reading every line like it might confess something she'd missed. The details were all there: his name, his calm, the lack of resistance. But what wasn't there, what had never been included, was his context, and she hadn't asked. She tapped the citation twice against her palm, staring now not at the words but at her own reflection in the dark window behind them. 30 years on the bench, and still the hardest cases were the ones that crept up when no one else noticed. Not the high-profile trials or shouting matches in open court. Those were easy, even predictable. But this was different. This was quiet, invisible, and made of something far more difficult to fix than paperwork. In law school, they taught her about bias in theory, about precedents and protocol, about keeping the bench above reproach. But they didn't teach her what it felt like to catch herself mid-assumption, to realize that speed had replaced judgment, that reputation had replaced curiosity, and that somewhere along the way she'd stopped looking people in the eye long enough to see who they really were. She stood and crossed the room, slowly opened the small cabinet beneath the window, and pulled out an old folder labeled Speaker Series, 2019. She remembered it vaguely, a guest panel she had RSVP'd to but skipped at the last minute because of back-to-back hearings. Flipping through the program guide, her eyes landed on a photo, a tall man with a composed expression and deep-set eyes, standing at a podium titled, "The Power of Silence in Federal Oversight." Beneath the image, the caption read, "Inspector Darius Rowe, Department of Justice." She let the folder drop to her side and sat down again, this time with a heaviness she couldn't quite shift. Maybe it wasn't just that she'd misjudged him. Maybe what unsettled her most was how natural it had felt at the time, how reflexively she'd reached for control, for authority, for the routine of rendering decisions without fully being present. And now, sitting there alone, the courthouse dark around her and the city pulsing softly outside her window, she wasn't just remembering his name. She was hearing the quiet in his voice, the way he'd stood there without correcting her, without insisting she listen, without needing to prove anything. That silence wasn't passivity, it was power, a kind she hadn't seen coming because it didn't need to announce itself. She placed the citation on the corner of her desk, smoothed its edges with one hand, and whispered aloud to no one in particular, "I should have asked." Then she turned off the lamp, the office falling into shadow, and sat there a moment longer before finally locking the door behind her and stepping out into the empty hallway, where her own footsteps felt louder than usual and every light above her buzzed just slightly out of tune. That night, long after the last motion was filed and the courthouse fell into its familiar hush of humming vents and echoing silence, Judge Marlene Whitaker sat on the worn edge of her living room couch legs, uncrossed slippers forgotten near the door, a law journal resting unopened on her lap. The television was on, but playing to no audience, some late-night rerun, flickering shadows across the walls, like ghosts of other conversations she wasn't really listening to. Her reading glasses hung loosely in one hand, fingers curled around the frame like she wasn't sure if she needed to read or just hold something solid. The house, always too quiet after 10, had that particular stillness that made memories louder than sound. She leaned back slowly, not out of comfort but out of habit, the kind of motion your body makes when you've done too much thinking but can't find the off switch. Her eyes weren't focused on the bookshelf across the room or the plaques and certificates carefully arranged in tidy rows, but on a corner of the rug near the window where the light caught the edge of the fringe, reminding her for some reason of a time when her daughter used to sit cross-legged doing math homework there, chewing on her pencil like it might solve the problem for her. That memory stung more than she expected, not because it hurt, but because it felt far away, like something she could reach toward but not touch. She remembered too clearly now, a courtroom from nearly 30 years earlier, her second year on the bench, when an older male attorney had called her young lady in open session after she overruled his objection. The room had gone quiet, then not out of respect but discomfort, and she had held her face like glass unbroken, refusing even a blink that might suggest the words had landed. That was the day she built her walls higher, firmer, made of policy and pace, and that steel-edged tone that made people sit straighter when she spoke. That was the day she decided to never again let anyone mistake her composure for weakness. The silence tonight felt like that same courtroom pause, except now she wasn't sure if she'd won anything by surviving it. She shifted slightly, opened the journal across her lap, and let her eyes pass over headlines she'd seen a dozen times before: federal reforms, judicial ethics, language in the courtroom, but none of it stuck. Her mind kept circling back to one image: Darius Rowe standing before her, calm, unassuming, not once pulling rank, not once needing to. It wasn't just that she hadn't recognized him, it was that she hadn't looked up long enough to try. She stood and moved toward the kitchen, poured herself a small glass of Merlot, not for the taste, but for the quiet weight it gave her hand, and leaned against the counter while the refrigerator hummed in the background. Somewhere in the hallway, the old floorboard creaked the way it always did when the air shifted, and for a second she felt like the house was watching her. Maybe it was. Her phone buzzed once on the counter, a message from Ava, short, thoughtful, the kind that said more in its restraint than in its words. "Hey, Mom, just checking in." "You good?" Marlene stared at it for a while before typing back. "All good, just tired." "How are you?" She didn't hit send right away, just held her thumb over the screen the way you do when you're thinking about something deeper but don't know how to say it without making everything sound heavier than it should. Eventually the reply came, "I'm okay. Long week. We'll call soon." And for the first time in a while, Marlene typed, "Yes, I'd like that." She set the phone down and walked slowly back to the couch, glass in hand, and sank into the cushion like someone surrendering to a weight that had been waiting all day. She thought about all the years she had poured herself into the system, showing up early, staying late, keeping her docket clean, and her voice sharper than the noise of the world outside. She thought that if she moved fast enough, people would respect the motion more than they questioned the judgment, and for a long time it had worked. No complaints, no wasted time, no need for second chances. But now she wondered how many moments she had missed by moving too quickly, how many stories had been reduced to citations, how many names had passed her bench without ever becoming faces. She took a slow sip of wine and let the warmth settle behind her sternum, not soothing, but steady. The badge Darius carried, she could still see it in her mind, that metallic gleam barely visible beneath the fold of his bag. He hadn't offered it, hadn't used it, hadn't needed to. And that, she realized, was what unsettled her the most. He hadn't demanded respect. He simply embodied it. And she hadn't seen it because she hadn't been looking. Outside, the wind rustled faintly through the hedges, brushing the window like a whisper too soft to follow. She turned off the television with a quiet click. And in the dimness of the room, she sat still for a long while, just listening to the hum of her own breath, to the echo of her choices, to the part of her that had stopped being a judge long enough to be a person again. And somewhere in the quiet, a question began to form, not loud, not urgent, just persistent enough to stay. What else have I missed? The next morning arrived, shrouded in a dull gray sky, the kind that settled over everything like a silent verdict, offering no clarity, but just enough light to remind you the day was moving forward, whether you were ready or not. Judge Marlene Whitaker walked through the courthouse's side entrance, bypassing the usual main hallway greetings, her coat pulled tighter around her shoulders, not just against the chill, but against the weight she hadn't been able to shake since last night. Her heels clicked softly across the polished tile, each step sounding louder in her own ears than usual, like echoes in a room where nothing wanted to stay hidden. She passed the kitchenette just outside the clerk's wing, and paused when she heard voices inside, not angry or loud, just low and sharpened, like people trying not to be overheard, but forgetting how thin walls can be. She recognized the tones, first Laura from records, steady and deliberate, and Benji, the new junior clerk, whose voice still carried that eager note of someone not yet hardened by repetition. "Not like he made a scene," Laura said, her words measured. "Number." But that's what made it worse. He didn't have to. There was a pause, short, but cutting, before Benji replied, voice softer. Just said who he was, and bam, courtroom flipped. Another pause followed, the kind that holds more weight than whatever words come next. Then Laura answered, and her voice landed like a stone dropped in still water. She didn't even apologize. Marlene's chest tightened as she stood there, just out of sight, the corner of the hallway, holding her like a shield she hadn't meant to find. Benji's voice came again, almost a whisper. "You think she would have treated him different if he looked like Bloom or Novak Silence?" Then Laura again, quieter now but unmistakable. "You already know." Marlene stepped back from the doorway before they could see her, her pulse strangely loud in her ears, her blazer suddenly feeling like it had shrunk half a size in the last few minutes. She took the long way around to her chambers, passing familiar doorways that didn't feel as neutral as they used to. Her thoughts scrambled into fragments she couldn't quite sort. Inside her office, the air felt too still. The blinds were already drawn open, letting in the flat morning light, and her desk had been neatly arranged by her clerk Rita, who looked up from the computer with her usual calm. "I pulled the docket like you asked," she said, holding up a file clipped tight with yellow tabs. "Full summary on Darius Rowe from DOJ Internal. 16 major federal cases since 2017. 11 involved multi-agency coordination. Do you want highlights or the full detail?" Marlene walked to her desk without answering immediately and sat down slowly, her hands resting in her lap before she reached for the folder. "Leave it," she said at last. "I'll go through everything." Rita hesitated, not in fear, but in quiet recognition that something had shifted, something too important to ignore. "Judge," she began, then paused again. "You know everyone's talking about it, right? Not just here. It's in the county circuit email chain now." Marlene didn't flinch, but something behind her eyes moved. "I figured," she replied, and Rita gave a small nod, offering nothing more before stepping out of the room and pulling the door shut behind her with a soft click. Alone again, Marlene opened the folder and began to read. Each case summary had Rowe's name at the top, tight-focused, exacting. His language was crisp, his conclusions methodical, and his command of detail unmistakable. She flipped through pages of coordinated sting operations, surveillance briefings, interdepartmental directives, all signed, all executed under his lead. The man she had brushed aside in court wasn't just important, he was meticulous. And the more she read, the more a strange ache settled deep in her chest. Not regret exactly, but something close to it, something that tasted like realization. She closed the folder halfway through and leaned back in her chair, letting her eyes drift toward the shelf across from her desk, the one filled with law books, framed commendations, and a photo of herself receiving her judicial appointment 2 decades ago. She remembered how proud she had been that day, not just because she'd earned it, but because she believed in what it meant to serve, to listen to, uphold. Somewhere along the way, she'd let efficiency replace empathy, let swiftness stand in for discernment, let being respected outweigh the need to remain aware. At 10:45, she stepped out to refill her coffee in the break room, which was nearly empty except for Judge Bloom standing by the counter stirring creamer into his mug. He looked up when she entered, offered a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and said, "Morning." "Morning," she replied, reaching for the pot. The silence between them was thick, like unspoken questions pressed between walls. Then Bloom said, "I read Rowe's filing from the Marston case. Impressive work." Marlene kept her face steady as she poured her coffee. "I'm reading through some of it now," she answered. Bloom took a slow sip, then added, "He's sharp. I sat in on one of his arguments last year. Took down 3 motions in under 20 minutes. Not the kind of person you forget." She didn't respond. Instead, she picked up her coffee and walked back toward her office, closing the door behind her with a little more force than usual. Back at her desk, she opened the folder again and flipped to the yellow tab marked Marston, Opening Remarks. Rowe's voice, printed cleanly in black ink, filled the page with a kind of quiet conviction that didn't need volume to carry weight. When power is used with integrity, it doesn't need to raise its volume. It just has to show up. Marlene sat motionless for a long time, the hum of the building soft in the background, the words echoing louder than anything else she'd heard all week. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel certain, not about her decisions, not about her role, not even about her own reflection in the glass. She only felt a need to sit longer in the silence, to let it teach her something she hadn't been willing to learn before. It was Friday afternoon when the manila envelope landed on her desk, slid there by Rita without a word, its smooth paper catching a slant of sunlight from the blinds like it had been waiting all day for this moment. Marlene was just returning from a hearing that had left her worn and short-tempered, a drawn-out child custody dispute filled with shouting parents and too many half-truths. She hadn't even taken off her coat yet when she saw the label printed neatly on the front, Judicial Review Submission, Assistant Inspector General Darius T. Rowe. Her breath caught not all at once, but in pieces like her lungs didn't quite trust what they were reading. Rita stood at the edge of the room with a calm face but careful eyes, the way someone looks when they've delivered something heavy and aren't sure if they'll be asked to carry it again. "Came through the circuit clerk's office about an hour ago," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I didn't read it." Just log the receipt." Marlene nodded once her fingers not reaching for the envelope, just resting against the desk like she needed to feel something solid before she opened anything else. "Thanks," she murmured, and Rita gave a small nod before quietly stepping out, closing the door behind her like someone exiting a confession booth. For a long moment, Marlene didn't move. She just looked at the envelope the way a person looks at something they can't put back once it's been opened, something that might not change the past but could certainly make it harder to ignore. The room was quiet except for the faint buzz of the overhead light, and the rhythmic tick of the second hand on the clock above the door, each sound more noticeable than it should have been. She finally slid a finger beneath the flap, slow and deliberate, like peeling back a memory she hadn't meant to revisit. Inside were 2 typed pages, single-spaced, crisp and direct. There was no drama in the language, no flair of accusation, just a steady, careful articulation of a moment he had lived, but she had missed. "During my appearance before Judge Whitaker," it began, "I was issued a citation without the opportunity to provide context or explanation." She read that line twice, not because it was unclear, but because it was. It was too clear, clean, measured, unshaken. He wasn't angry, he was exact. The review didn't request disciplinary action or call for correction. Instead, it offered a mirror. "While I respect the efficiency of municipal proceedings," he wrote, "I believe the circumstances highlight a need for renewed attention to procedural discretion." Her throat tightened not out of guilt but out of recognition. She could hear his voice in those sentences, the same calm that had filled the courtroom, the same restraint that had haunted her afterward, not because he'd withheld something, but because he hadn't needed to raise it. He had simply shown up and she had simply missed him. The letter continued tracing, not the fine itself, but the implications of silence, how assumption when unchecked shapes more than outcomes. It shapes the space between people, the trust between systems, the very tone of justice itself. "I submit this not as a grievance, but as a reminder of what's at stake when we let systems move faster than people." Marlene read that line again, her eyes blurring slightly at the edges, not with tears, but with the kind of clarity that stings. When she finished, she set the letter down and leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling tiles like they might hold some kind of answer. Her hands rested flat on her thighs, unmoving, as if her whole body had to pause long enough to accept what her mind was only beginning to. He could have written something scathing. He could have gone to the press. He could have used her name in circles that would echo, but instead he had written this quiet, firm, and undeniably true. She stood and walked toward the window, her shoes making soft sounds on the carpet, and looked out over the parking lot, the rows of cars motionless beneath the setting sun. She pressed her fingers gently to the glass, not for balance but for anchor, like if she didn't hold on to something she might float away from herself. Her reflection looked back familiar and foreign all at once, a woman who had built a fortress out of rules and speed, only to realize that not every wall was keeping the right things out. Part of her wanted to call the presiding judge to ask what the usual response was, in a situation like this, to retreat into protocol and procedure like she always had. But another part, quieter and older, knew that this wasn't about the usual. This was personal, not in the way of ego, but in the way of conscience. So instead, she returned to her desk and picked up the letter again, reading it not as a judge, but as a person who had gotten something wrong and was finally ready to face it. Her eyes settled on the number listed at the bottom, a direct line to his office, and she reached for the phone before she could talk herself out of it. The dial tone buzzed once, twice, and then a voice answered. "Assistant Inspector Rowe's office," the woman said. "Yes," Marlene replied, steadying her voice. "This is Judge Marlene Whitaker. I'm calling regarding the letter he submitted. It's personal." There was a pause, then a polite, "Please hold." Seconds passed before his voice came through, low and even. "Judge Whitaker," he said, not unkind, just cautious. She took a breath, her hand gripping the receiver a little tighter. "I read your letter," she began. "You didn't have to write it, but you did, and it landed." Another pause. "I appreciate that," he said quietly, "and I meant every word." Her eyes drifted toward the window again. The sun now dipped halfway behind the trees. "I made a mistake," she said, "not in issuing the citation, but in how I handled it. I'm not calling as a judge right now. I'm calling as someone who forgot to slow down." The line stayed quiet for a moment, not heavy, just full. Then his voice came softer this time. "Thank you for saying that. Most people wouldn't." She nodded, even though he couldn't see. "Growth rarely makes noise," he added, "but sometimes the smallest admissions change the biggest rooms." And just like that, the call ended not with resolution, but with recognition, and that she realized might be exactly where change begins. 3 days later, the sky above the city had taken on that particular color, only found in late winter, something between pale silver and reluctant blue. A sky that felt undecided, stretched thin over rooftops like a bedsheet left out in the place. Cold. Judge Marlene Whitaker stood outside the federal courthouse downtown, her hands tucked into her coat pockets, not for warmth but to keep from fidgeting, which was rare for her. She hadn't told anyone she was coming, hadn't RSVP'd to the invitation tucked in her inbox 2 weeks ago, the one marked high-profile pretrial hearing, Marston case, observer access available. She hadn't planned on attending, not at first. But this morning she woke with a quiet urgency that wouldn't let her sit still, like some part of her knew the only way forward was to face the part of herself she'd tried not to look at too closely. Inside the building hummed with the energy that only comes with big cases, tight clusters of attorneys speaking in hushed tones, paralegals moving fast with boxes of exhibits, reporters camped out by the stairwells checking their cameras and notes. Marlene moved among them unnoticed, her face half shielded by the collar of her coat and the rhythm of someone who didn't want attention. She slipped into the back row of courtroom 4, just as the proceedings resumed, finding an empty seat between an older man she vaguely recognized from past circuit meetings and a young woman scribbling into a notepad with practiced speed. At the front of the room, standing in that still focused posture that needed no exaggeration, was Darius Rowe. He didn't glance toward the gallery, didn't search for familiar faces. His eyes were locked on the defense witness, a forensic accountant shifting uncomfortably on the stand. The lighting in the room was sterile, but somehow it framed Darius differently. His navy suit sharp, his notes minimal, his presence steady in the way gravity is steady. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every question he asked carried the kind of weight that made people lean in, not from suspense, but from respect. "So, Mr. Flay," he said, his tone, "even when you say the withdrawals were unusual, do you mean in pattern amount or origin?" The witness hesitated, blinked, adjusted his glasses. Mostly pattern, I guess." Darius didn't rush. He let the silence stretch just long enough to invite discomfort. "You guess?" he asked, not accusing, just pointed. I mean pattern," the man corrected himself quickly. "The withdrawals didn't match salary cycles, and they always occurred within 24 hours of transfers from the shell companies." Darius nodded slightly, then leaned in just enough to close the space between question and conclusion. "And were these entities, Panessa Logistics and Kepler Trades, linked by any registered owner?" The accountant swallowed. "Yes. Same registered agent, same office suite." "No further questions," Darius said, stepping back. He didn't smile, didn't nod to the jury, didn't need the room to applaud. The silence that followed said more than applause ever could. Marlene hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath until that moment, and when she finally exhaled, it felt like something inside her chest had shifted position. She wasn't watching a man perform. She was witnessing someone execute purpose with precision. And for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't thinking about the bench or protocol or who was watching. She was just listening. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur. She barely registered the attorneys switching roles, the objections noted, the recess called. She kept her eyes on Darius as he returned to his seat beside co-counsel, quietly passing notes, receiving updates, never once losing focus. He didn't command the room with volume. He simply was the room. She sat frozen in place, unsure if she wanted to be seen, unsure if it mattered anymore. When recess was called, people stood stretched, filed out to the hallway already discussing strategy and implications. But Marlene didn't move. She remained in her seat watching him gather his notes with that same deliberate calm. Then, as if he had known she was there all along, he looked up briefly, directly meeting her eyes for a second that held everything and explained nothing. He didn't nod. He didn't frown, just acknowledged her presence with quiet certainty, then turned away and exited with his team. She waited a few seconds longer before rising, not because she needed time, but because she owed herself the silence. The hallway outside buzzed with sound, clerk chatter, doors opening, footsteps trailing off, but none of it reached her fully. She stood near the windows, where thin lines of rain had begun to draw streaks down the glass, the city reflected in smudged layers against her coat. Her face looked older in the glass, not tired, not defeated, just real. The kind of real that doesn't hide from its own evolution. Behind her, 2 junior prosecutors were speaking, their voices just audible. "I still don't know how he keeps it all in his head like that. He's been up since 4. I saw him in the war room running questions." Marlene turned slightly, listening not to the words, but to the reverence in their tone. Not fear, not awe, just earned respect. And that more than any filing, any reprimand, any public reckoning was what struck her deepest. She had fined a man like that without asking a single question. She didn't cry. That wasn't her way. But as she stepped into the elevator and watched the doors close, a silence settled around her that carried a different kind of weight, the kind you don't put down when the day ends. The kind you carry not as shame but as responsibility. And maybe, she thought as the floor number ticked upward, maybe that's what justice really demands. Not perfection, not pride, but the willingness to change your posture once you finally see who's standing in front of you. The following Monday, the courthouse settled back into its usual rhythm. Security checks at the front doors, the soft shuffle of shoes along marble floors, clerks balancing coffee in one hand and manila folders in the other, like it was all part of some silent dance choreographed by routine. But Marlene felt the difference in the air before she even stepped through the double doors. It wasn't something anyone said, and it wasn't written anywhere, but it was there in the way people glanced up from their desks and actually looked at each other, in how greetings felt a little less rushed, in how the day started, not with urgency, but with attention. She walked through those familiar hallways, slower than usual, her coat buttoned clean, but her face less composed than before, as if she'd stopped practicing a look and started living in her own. She paused to greet the bailiff by name, asked the clerk how her son was recovering from the flu, even offered a half-smile to the young assistant, who dropped her pen on the marble and blushed trying to pick it up. None of it was planned. None of it was performative. It was just different. And while she remained the same woman with the same title, something inside her had softened in a way that wasn't weakness. It was something stronger, quieter, harder to name, but easy to feel. In her chambers, the first case sat waiting on her desk, a 21-year-old nursing student with 2 part-time jobs and a citation for expired registration tags. A week ago, she might have glanced at the fine amount, scrawled her initials, and moved on without pause. But this time she reached for the phone and asked, "Can we bring Miss Lambert in 5 minutes early? I'd like to speak with her before the hearing starts." That single sentence shifted the entire energy of the morning. At 9:10, the young woman stood nervously before the bench, her hair pulled into a neat bun, hands trembling slightly as she clutched a folder of documents she wasn't even asked for. Marlene looked at her not as a problem to be solved, but as a person worth knowing. "Miss Lambert," she said gently, "I see you've been cited for driving with expired registration. Can you tell me more about that?" The young woman blinked as if unsure whether it was a trick question, then nodded slowly. "My paycheck was late. I've been helping cover my mom's medications out of pocket. I didn't mean to avoid it, I just needed a little time." Marlene listened not just with her ears, but with her face, with her stillness. She waited a moment before responding. "I appreciate your honesty. Let's set a payment date that works for you, and we'll waive the late penalty. Please make sure your registration is updated by then, and we'll keep this off your record." Miss Lambert's shoulders dropped like she'd been holding up 100 pounds with breath alone. "Thank you," she whispered, voice shaking. "Truly." Marlene gave her a small nod, not one of superiority, but of shared understanding, then moved on to the next case. By mid-morning, the courtroom had settled into a rhythm that felt less mechanical and more human. There were still fines, still rules, still structure, but underneath it all was something new. Or maybe it wasn't new. Maybe it had always been there waiting for her to notice. Her decisions came with the same efficiency, but not the same detachment. She looked people in the eye. She asked. She listened. Not because she doubted the law, but because she remembered that the law meant nothing without the people it served. At lunch, her phone buzzed, just as she stepped into the small courtyard outside chambers. It was a message from an unfamiliar number, but she didn't need the ID to recognize the tone. Judge Whitaker, the message read, "I hope this isn't a bad time. I just wanted to thank you again for the call." It was signed simply D. Rowe. She paused for a moment before calling him back, standing in the crisp air near a stone bench where two pigeons were squabbling over a crust of bread. When he picked up, his voice was calm as it always was. "Judge Whitaker." "Mr. Rowe," she said, more relaxed than she expected. "Thank you for your message. I've been thinking about what you said." He was quiet for a moment, then replied, "I meant it. I know how rare that is in our line of work to hear someone admit they got it wrong. And not just wrong in action, but in instinct." She nodded, even though he couldn't see it. "I wasn't proud of how I handled that hearing. I like to believe I'm a fair judge, but fair doesn't mean infallible." There was a pause, not tense, just full of mutual awareness. "I believe you can be both," he said. "That's why I submitted the review. Not to humiliate you, just to hold space for reflection." She didn't respond right away. She just looked out at the courtyard where the wind was now brushing lightly through the hedges and the sun had begun to warm the brick walls with a kind of quiet dignity. "You did that," she said at last. "Truthfully, I wasn't sure I'd respond. I wasn't even sure I could." He chuckled softly on the other end. "Truthfully, neither was I." They didn't talk long, and when the call ended, it didn't feel like closure. It felt like opening a door that had been locked for too long. She stood there a while longer, coat unbuttoned, face soft in the light. And when she returned to the courtroom, the docket was still full, the rules still applied, but her presence was different. Not louder, just clearer. And sometimes that's enough to shift the way justice sounds when it finally learns how to listen. 2 weeks passed, and though the courthouse walls hadn't changed and the routines unfolded just as they always had, something intangible in the rhythm of courtroom, 3 had begun to shift small, almost invisible changes that didn't register at first glance but slowly began to alter the air. Judge Marlene Whitaker no longer walked with the practiced distance that once wrapped around her like armor. Instead, she moved through the hallways with her eyes lifted, her gaze softer, her silences deeper, not heavier. Her presence was still deliberate, still composed, but no longer guarded by the same reflexive detachment she used to call professionalism. Each morning her docket was still full, her robe still pressed, her pen still poised, but now there was a pause, a breath between each case, a moment of acknowledgement that didn't appear in transcripts but lingered just the same. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, her voice carried not only the authority of the law but also the awareness of its consequences. Her questions were different now, not longer, not softer, but intentional. "Can you explain what led you here?" had begun to replace "you've been cited for." And somehow that slight recalibration began to echo in the courtroom itself. That Tuesday morning, the case that caught her attention wasn't remarkable. On paper, a 62-year-old woman contesting a parking violation she claimed was issued in error. In the past, Marlene might have sighed internally, flagged it as one of 100 technicalities, and moved on. But when the woman stepped forward, silver hair pulled back into a neat bun, documents clutched in both hands, voice quiet but firm, Marlene didn't interrupt. She simply said, "Take your time," and leaned forward just enough to make space for something real. The woman presented her case with photos printed on regular copy paper circled in blue pen, with notes about signage and timelines. Her hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the weight of being heard. And when she finished, Marlene took a moment before responding, studying not just the evidence but the effort behind it. "Thank you," she said gently. "That was clear and helpful. Based on what you've shown, I'm ruling in your favor." A beat of silence followed, and then a quiet ripple moved through the room. Not applause, not relief exactly, but something closer to recognition. Marlene wasn't pandering and she wasn't posturing. She was doing her job, but she was doing it with presence, and that changed everything. At the back of the courtroom, a young law clerk leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "She's different lately. It's like she's watching people now, not just files." The colleague nodded, not in judgment, but in agreement, as if they'd both noticed something they hadn't known how to name. The truth was, Marlene was still learning how to name it herself. Later that day, during her lunch break, she sat in her chambers with her inbox open, the overhead light casting a warm glow on her desk. as she clicked on a video link she'd been meaning to watch. It was a keynote speech from the Western States Prosecutors Summit titled "Assumption and Authority: How Our Positions Shape and Distort Perception." And there he was again, Darius Rose, standing at a podium, tie loosened slightly, sleeves rolled just enough to reveal a working man's approach to difficult rooms. He didn't speak like someone delivering a lecture. He spoke like someone offering a mirror, and Marlene couldn't look away. In courtrooms across this country, he said, voice even and unhurried justice is often decided in less than 5 minutes. We see someone, we hear a charge, and before they even speak, we've decided who they are. He paused, and even through the screen it landed with weight. It's not always out of malice, he continued. Sometimes it's habit. Sometimes it's pressure. Sometimes it's just fatigue. But whatever the cause, the cost is always the same. People stop being people. They become paperwork. Marlene paused the video, her own reflection staring back at her from the dark screen. She had done that, too many times to count. Not because she meant to harm anyone, but because it had been easier to keep the line moving, easier to see the law as a system instead of a relationship. And in doing so, she had robbed herself of the very clarity she believed she stood for. That afternoon, she heard a shoplifting case, teenage boy, first offense, no record. His mother sat in the gallery, wringing a tissue between her fingers like it might hold her whole life together. Marlene looked at the boy and asked, "Tell me what happened." He hesitated, then spoke not just about the mistake, but about the pressure at home, the loss of his mother's job, the groceries he'd tried to take, not for himself but for her. He wasn't making excuses. He was taking responsibility. She didn't fine him. She assigned community service, 2 counseling sessions, and a reflection letter due in 30 days. As he left, his mother mouthed the words, "Thank you." Marlene didn't respond aloud, but something shifted in her chest, a quiet rearranging of the way she held authority. That night, as she walked to her car in the near-empty lot, the sky turning deep blue with the slow retreat of day, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't relief. It wasn't pride. It was peace, not because the job had gotten easier, but because she had finally stopped trying to prove she was in control. She had started showing up fully human first, judge second. And sometimes that was enough to make the system feel like it could still mean something. 2 more weeks passed, and though no announcements had been made and no memos were sent, everyone in the building had begun to notice that courtroom 3 had changed. The walls were the same off-white. They'd always been. The fluorescent lights still buzzed faintly overhead, and the wooden bench still creaked when someone leaned the wrong way, but the space itself had taken on a different energy. It wasn't dramatic, not loud or obvious, but it was real. The tempo was slower, not sluggish, just deliberate. And for the first time in a long time, the space between questions and answers had grown wide enough to allow honesty to walk in without tripping over urgency. Judge Marlene Whitaker sat at the bench with the same posture she always had, upright, attentive, composed, but something behind her eyes was softer now, less fixed on the destination and more curious about the path each person had taken to get here. Her rulings were still firm, her voice still clear, but her tone had shifted from control to clarity, from assumption to inquiry. And that shift didn't just affect how she was heard. It changed how people spoke to her. That morning, an older woman came forward with a stack of carefully organized papers to dispute a parking citation she believed had been issued in error. Her hair was salt and pepper, her sweater well worn, and her hands trembled slightly as she passed the evidence to the clerk. In the past, Marlene might have interrupted, might have redirected her to the fine table, might have treated the case as one more box to check. But today she leaned forward just slightly, folded her hands on the bench, and said gently, "Take your time." The woman blinked, surprised by the invitation, then slowly walked the court through her case photos printed on plain copy paper, times and locations highlighted in blue pen, street signs carefully circled. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. But it was human. And when she finished, Marlene looked over the documents in silence, then said, "You've made your case clearly. I'm ruling in your favor." The woman let out a soft breath she didn't seem to realize she'd been holding, and though she didn't speak again, her smile lingered as she turned to leave. At the back of the room, a young law clerk observed quietly, jotting notes, not just on the case but on the tone of the interaction. Later, leaning toward a colleague in the copy room, he said softly, "She's changed. Not in a big way, but she sees people now, not just paperwork." And the colleague, after a pause, nodded and said, "Maybe that's all it ever takes." Back in her chambers at noon, Marlene sat with her lunch untouched, and her inbox open, her attention fixed on a video she had started and paused more than once. It was another clip from the prosecutors' summit, this time a panel discussion titled, "When Power Listens." Darius Rowe was speaking again, this time seated beside two state attorneys and a federal public defender, his tone as steady as ever. He wasn't lecturing, he was offering something more difficult: vulnerability wrapped in discipline. In this work, he said, we are trained to listen for confession, for contradiction, for weakness. But how often do we listen for understanding? The moderator asked. And what happens when we don't? Darius paused, looked down briefly, then answered, we forget who the system is for. And when that happens, justice becomes a performance instead of a promise. Marlene paused the video again, her own reflection flickering back from the darkened screen. Her face looked different than it had a month ago, not older, just quieter, like someone who'd been walking fast for years and had finally learned how to stop without fear. That afternoon, a teenage boy stood before her on a shoplifting charge, first offense, no record. His mother sat in the gallery, her fingers twisted tightly in a wrinkled tissue, eyes filled with worry but not surprise. Marlene looked at the boy and said, "Tell me what happened." He hesitated, then began, not just with the act itself, but with everything that had led to it. His mom had lost her job. The fridge was nearly empty. He saw a shortcut, and he took it not because he wanted to steal, but because he wanted to help. She listened not just to the words, but to the shame behind them, to the effort it took to speak them aloud. Then she ruled, not with punishment, but with restoration. A diversion program, community service, 2 counseling sessions, a written reflection due in 30 days. Use this, she said, to understand yourself better, not just to avoid coming back. The boy nodded, eyes wide, and his mother mouthed, "Thank you," as they turned to leave. Marlene didn't respond aloud, but inside something loosened, a pressure she hadn't noticed until it began to lift. That evening, as she walked to her car under a slowly darkening sky, the wind brushing gently across the lot, she felt something unfamiliar and old, at the same time, peace. Not because her work was done, not because the world had changed, but because she had. The courthouse behind her stood the same as always, brick and glass, tall and solid, but to her it looked less like a fortress and more like a place that could breathe again. And maybe that was the difference. Maybe the work wasn't about keeping control. Maybe it was about letting presence do what control never could. It was a quiet Friday afternoon when the envelope arrived. No fanfare, no knock at the door, just a soft rustle of paper against paper as Rita placed it on the edge of Judge Marlene Whitaker's desk, her voice low, almost hesitant. "Came through courier," she said, her eyes flickering briefly toward the return address. "No sender, just your name." Marlene looked up from the file she'd been annotating, her pen still in hand, the weight of the day lingering in her shoulders like an old coat she'd forgotten to take off. She didn't reach for the envelope right away. Instead, she let it sit there for a moment, plain and unassuming, like a question that wasn't in a hurry to be answered. When she finally picked it up, the paper felt familiar in her hands, thick, smooth, deliberate. She unfolded it slowly, the motion careful, as if the contents might shift the air around her. Inside was a simple card, ivory white, folded once. No header, no signature, just a single line of handwriting centered on the inside. Sometimes justice doesn't need volume, it just needs to show up. That was it. No explanation. No sender's name. But she knew. Of course she knew. She stared at the words for a long while, her thumb brushing gently across the ink, as if tracing the intention behind it. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't an apology. It was a reflection, a mirror held up not just to her actions but to her evolution. She set the card beside her gavel next to the framed photo of her swearing-in ceremony from years ago, the one where she stood so straight, so certain, so armored. The irony wasn't lost on her. Back then, she thought the strength of justice lived in decisiveness, in control, in never looking back. Now she understood It lived in the quiet, in the pauses, in the decision to see someone fully before deciding what they deserved. That evening, as she locked her chambers and stepped into the fading light of the courtyard, the sounds of the courthouse softened behind her footsteps, diminishing voices settling the door's latch, clicking into place like the closing of a long, slow chapter. The air was cool but not cold, and the sky was painted with the warm tones of a late-setting sun, the kind that made you want to sit still and say nothing for a while. She paused near the bench where she often drank her morning coffee, looking at it differently now, not as a checkpoint but as a place of rest. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. A message from her daughter, Ava. "Thinking of you today. You'd be proud I mediated a tough call at work without snapping." Marlene smiled quietly to herself, typing back, "Proud of you always. Let's talk soon." She slid the phone away, not to escape the world but to re-enter it more completely. Her steps down the walkway were unhurried, her heels striking the pavement with a rhythm that no longer demanded to be heard. She was no longer walking to prove something. She was walking because it felt good to move forward. That weekend, she returned to her house, and for the first time in years, opened the guest room closet to pull out an old wooden box that hadn't been touched since her early days on the bench. Inside were notes, programs, conference passes, pieces of a career built brick by brick, word by word. She didn't open them to reminisce. She opened them because she finally had the patience to look back without judgment. She found a notepad from a seminar on judicial ethics, a faded program with a photo of her younger self beside two mentors who had since passed. And tucked at the bottom was a folded flyer from that long-ago DOJ summit. She'd skipped Darius Rowe's name, listed as a breakout speaker. She held it for a moment, then slipped it into her current case folder, not to prove anything but to remember. Growth didn't erase the past. It informed the future, and some reminders belonged in view, not tucked away. The following Monday, the docket began like any other. A young man with a suspended license stood before her, nervous, his hands gripping the edge of the podium. He had missed his court date once already, and the record showed a pattern of lateness. But when Marlene looked at him, she didn't just see the data. She saw a human being trying to stand upright in a system that rarely invited complexity. She asked him what had happened. He stammered, then explained how he'd been working double shifts since his father got sick, how he'd meant to come, how the car had broken down and he couldn't afford the tow. She listened not because she doubted him, but because she knew that listening was the first form of justice. "Let's set a new date," she said. "Get things in order. Keep in touch with the clerk's office. We'll move forward from there." He nodded, eyes wide, grateful not just for the ruling but for the space she had made for him to speak. As the courtroom settled into its steady rhythm again, Marlene felt a stillness settle into her, not inertia, but alignment. She wasn't perfect. She never had been. But she was present, and that more than anything was what she wanted to carry forward. That evening, as she stepped into her car and turned the key, the radio came on mid-song, an old jazz standard, warm and melancholy. She let it play hands, resting on the wheel, eyes, watching the sky shift from amber to deep blue. She didn't rush. She didn't measure the day in cases cleared or motions filed. She measured it in presence, in the quiet moments between decisions, in the weight of showing up. And as she pulled away from the courthouse, she wasn't thinking about how she'd been seen. She was thinking about what she'd finally begun to see. Sometimes it's not the loudest voices that bring justice. It's the quiet ones that show up with presence, humility, and the courage to listen. Judge Marlene Whitaker's journey wasn't about dramatic reversals or courtroom fireworks. It was about one human moment, one misjudgment that opened the door to transformation. We all carry habits, assumptions, and routines that protect us, especially as we grow older. But true wisdom, the kind that lasts, comes when we pause, reflect, and admit we don't always get it right. And more importantly, when we choose to grow anyway. This story reminds us that respect isn't always earned by rank or title. Sometimes it's the quiet dignity of a man like Darius Rowe who chose grace over ego that teaches us the most. Whether we're sitting behind a bench, standing in line at the pharmacy, or listening to a loved one at the dinner table, we all have the chance to show up differently, to see people fully, to ask before assuming, and to lead not with power but with presence. If this story moved you, even just a little, Take a moment to reflect on where you might slow down and listen more deeply in your own life. And if you believe in stories that stir the heart, challenge the mind, and remind us of who we can still become, please like this video, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to our channel. Because sometimes the quietest stories leave the loudest echoes, and we've got more of them to tell.